In this video, we are going to be discussing the topics in chapter 15, which is an introduction to metabolism. So, the first thing that we need to learn to define is the actual word metabolism. Understand that metabolism are the chemical processes that occur within a living organism in order to maintain life. Now, when it comes to metabolism, as you can see in this diagram, it is a complex network of reactions. We can have metabolism of complex carbohydrates. We can have metabolism of complex lipids. We can have metabolisms of amino acids, just to name a few. This diagram also introduces the idea that all of these metabolic pathways are actually going to be present in compartmentalized areas of an organism. As you can see here, specifically energy metabolism, it is concentrated in the mitochondria of the cell, and many of the other ones that we see here are in the cytoplasm. But one of the main points is, as you can see, it is a full network and they're all interconnected with one another. Now, understand that when it comes to metabolic pathways, there's going to be two main types of reactions that are carried out. One set of reactions are going to be anabolic reactions. And when it comes to anabolic reactions, as you can see, is where we go from smaller molecules, and you have to have an energy input. And that's how larger molecules are made. These anabolic reactions are going to be needed for cell maintenance, growth, and reproduction. We can also have catabolic reactions. And in catabolic reactions, we are converting larger molecules into smaller molecules. Energy is going to be released from these processes. So many of the pathways that we are going to be learning throughout this course are going to be from catabolic reactions. We may have a few examples of anabolic reactions also. When it comes to metabolic pathways, understand that there are going to be different forms of them. We can have metabolic pathways that are linear. And where we have a linear metabolic pathways, understand that this is a series of independent enzyme catalyzed reactions in which is more similar to organic chemistry reactions. We have a reactant that enzymatically is converted to the product, and that product then becomes the reactant of the next reaction. As you can see, is linear. It goes one molecule gets converted into another one, and once that molecule is produced, then it's taken through a series of steps to get to the major product in a particular system. We can also have a metabolic pathway which is cyclic. And when it comes to a cyclic metabolic pathway, this is going to be a sequence of enzyme catalyzed steps that form a closed loop. Here what we have as an example, it is something that we will be talking about in later weeks. And just to introduce it, that is actually the Krebs cycle. Or the TCA cycle, which is known as carboxylic acid or the citrate cycle. These are all names for it. The main thing is that when it comes to a cyclic cycle, as you can see, it is a closed loop. Just to talk about this one specifically, we can see that this is a closed loop because the product overall of our cycle, which is oxaloacetate, it is actually involved in the first reaction of the pathway. Now, we can also have a metabolic pathway that it is a spiral pathway. And as you can see here, in a spiral pathway, the same set of enzymes that is used to enlarge, meaning lengthening a particular biomolecule, are the same enzymes that are utilized to shorten it. So we can see here that this is going to show, as an example, lipids formation and lipid breakdown as an example of a spiral pathway. Now, it is also important to note that metabolism is going to proceed in discrete steps. Here, we actually have two examples of either an anabolic pathway and a catabolic pathway. So, when it comes to this, we can see that if we have metabolic pathways in any of these two reactions, energy is actually going to be input little by little, okay, instead of being all put at once. Because remember, all these metabolic pathways are actually being done enzymatically. So even when we are doing a catabolic pathway, so for example, taking glucose, combining it with oxygen and making CO2 and water, you can see that this is done in a multi-step sequence. The best example of this is when we eat glucose and we produce energy, we are going to see that through glycolysis, which is chapter 17, the TCA cycle, which is chapter 19, in oxidative phosphorylation, how this energy is released little by little. In biological systems, we do not have an uncontrolled combustion that is going to generate all this energy at once. It's going to be done in discrete pathways. And even, for example, if plants, through the process of photosynthesis, are creating glucose from CO2 and water, as we can see on the image on A, this cannot be done in one step. Even that energy input has to be in discrete steps. Whenever we're talking about all of this energy, remember that we need to remind ourselves of Gibbs free energy. In Gibbs free energy, remember that it is negative for a spontaneous process. What we're going to see is that many biological systems, we're going to have spontaneous processes, which means that it's going to have a Gibbs free energy value that is going to be less than 0. And we can also see that there's going to be some instances in which some of these processes are non-spontaneous, which means that the delta G value, in other words, the Gibbs free energy, is going to be larger than 0. This image is actually just illustrating how in a spontaneous process, outside energy is not required in order for the system to go. So for example, if you leave that rock at the edge of that hill, it will eventually roll down. And then the non-spontaneous process, this image is just illustrating how those processes, energy has to be input in order for the process to happen. In this case, this person, it is trying to put that rock at the top of the hill, and that will require energy. Now, in biological systems, we see that spontaneous reactions are coupled with non-spontaneous reactions. What does this mean? That when we have these two types of reaction coupled with each other, because non-spontaneous reactions require energy input, that energy that it is required by the non-spontaneous reaction to happen actually comes from the energy that is released by a spontaneous reaction. The image in the middle is just representing specifically how we can actually relate it to some processes that are going to be happening in plants. So as you can see here, we can have the sun actually give energy into the system. Okay, and here is illustrating how the hydrogen in the sun can be converted to the helium. I'm not going to be exploring that specifically, but we can imagine how the sun in the process of photosynthesis is going to give energy. And as you can see, when that energy is coupled with CO2 and water, plants can produce glucose and oxygen. That glucose and that oxygen, through the process of metabolism, as you can see, it can generate a molecule that it is the energy currency of the cell, that it is adenosine triphosphate. And we are going to see later in the chapter how adenosine triphosphate, when it gets hydrolyzed to adenosine diphosphate, that energy that is released from that hydrolysis, it can be utilized for the cell to go and perform some reactions. So, as I was just mentioning, when in cells reactions are happening, we are going to be coupling non-spontaneous processes with spontaneous processes. Let me give you another example. As you can see here, we have the example of looking at taking glucose, which the chemical formula for it is C6H12O6. When that glucose is interacting with O2, we are going to be producing CO2 and water. That whole process, as you can see, because it has a negative delta G, it is a spontaneous process. Now, when this process happens, as you can see, along with it, we are able to synthesize some energy in the form of ATP. Now, here, making that ATP, if we look at the Gibbs free energy for it, it is actually a non-spontaneous process. And again, they're happening coupled to each other. But when we look at the overall reaction, meaning that glucose interacting with that O2, and also the synthesis of that energy in the form of ATP, we look at the process as overall spontaneous, because when we look at it overall, coupling these two processes, it is actually given an overall delta G that it is negative, so the process overall is considered as spontaneous.